Now, a recent paper titled "It's My Job: A Qualitative Study of the Mediatization of Science within the scientist-journalist relationship." It is a mouthful. Tried to look at this relationship more closely, and today we're joined by one of our journalists, Gina Errico, who actually looked at the paper and engaged with the authors to get their take and insight into the paper. Gina, welcome to Questions of the Day.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So Gina, take us back a little bit. You read the paper. At the highest level, what were they trying to do?
Yeah, so the whole idea was, like you were saying, a lot of people are thinking about the relationship between scientists and the media. And obviously with COVID, this became a huge controversy and like really highlighted for a lot of people, there's this gap and something needs to happen. And so the idea behind the paper was to interview scientists and see sort of how they understood the processes that journalists and the media went through and how they felt about the entire process itself. Earlier on, there's a lot of animosity between the two groups, even though really they were trying to go towards the same goal of like sharing science with the community. And so this was sort of like a check-in into it and see sort of where we are now and where we need to go with it.
Yeah, so it was like kind of a pulse check, right? Let's check under the hood and see what's going on. And I don't know if you had looked prior to this, how much work had been done looking at this relationship. Do you ever take on that?
Okay. Yeah, so not a whole lot. There was a study they mentioned in the paper by an earlier scientist who tried to understand the media logic, which is what journalists and media use to really sort of explain science. So the ability to like understand it, but then also to convey it to other audiences. And they had found that scientists were aware of it. But now we're seeing sort of this third step, and that's what the paper is really highlighting. So it's not just about, being able to explain the research and being able to explain it in a way that people understand it. But now there's this thing that they notice, affiliation, essentially, which is like an excitement for it. Like the scientists want to share their work. They want to talk to the media. And that's like the big takeaway from this part now, is that it's not only are they understanding the process that the media is going through, they're really excited to be a part of it.
Yeah. And in fact, in the paper, there were some of those who responded who were, at least the scientists, who were surprised at the sophistication that some journalists had, right, in their processing. Can you tell us more about that?
A lot of them noted that they were really excited to see that the journalists would check back in with them to make sure that things were clear. And it's actually really interesting because as somebody who has worked in both worlds, I have met with a lot of journalists who you would think they were scientists because they're like, oh yeah, I totally understand this process because they've talked to so many scientists about it, but they'll still go in and say like, okay, make sure this is how they did it. So it's almost like this second scientific process in and of itself, being able to understand what they're saying and then making sure that you're following up with it. So I think it's a lot more back and forth than people realize. I think sometimes when people think about the media, there's this very scary stigma. You think of like tabloids and such, where they're sort of just like reporting and not really going too in deep to what's going on. Whereas with science journalism, you really have to understand the processes because you don't want to just say something that's not necessarily true. And then if something like that happens, you sort of lose a relationship with a scientist because they no longer trust you. So it's really cool to see how people are really truly understanding, like this is a sort of teamwork type process. Like as much as journalists want to get that stuff out there, they want it to be accurate and the scientists want it to be accurate. And so it's really cool to see like, oh yeah, like we're doing this together. And this is a really exciting process.
Yeah. And I think, so in the logic that you mentioned earlier, right? So adaptation of media logic, adoption of media logic, and affiliation of media logic. So people should read this paper, first of all, to get at these differences that are there. So you talked, or at least you engaged with the authors. What did you ask them and what did they tell you?
Yeah, so I talked to the main author on this paper, Dr. Muindi, and she was actually a journalist gone scientist, essentially. So she knew how the process behind like interviewing scientists worked, which has inspired sort of the research that came out of this paper. So that was really cool because as someone who went from scientists to media, it's really interesting to sort of see how that swap works. And so she was really excited to take sort of this concept that we've all been talking about, right? Scientists and media connections are extremely important. And she wanted to know sort of what's going on, right? How are we updated in this world? This is post-COVID, so we've got all this miscommunication of science going on. Have we sort of taken a step back where people and scientists are no longer having that engagement, or is it sort of the opposite? And so she was telling me that a lot of scientists who weren't even really involved in COVID research, so people who were studying like, snails and things that weren't vaccine related, were realizing, oh my gosh, there's such a huge gap between us and society, and like we need to do something about it. So COVID changed everything for the science and media relationship, which is something the both of us seemed really excited about, which was kind of cool. And so her goal is to sort of, that whole goal of the paper was to highlight, hey, things are changing and everyone's excited, which is really great, in this field. And in the future, she was talking about how she wants to sort of do more quantitative studies to figure out the impact. So not only are these relationships growing and building and, gaining traction, we're getting all this really good, informative science communication and science writing, but how is that impacting society in a way, right? Like, how are we changing our perceptions of science in the media from these building relationships? And so that's something that's really exciting.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that it's actually more in the works, right? And they do talk about this in the paper as well. Now, Moorhead, the lead author, mentioned in the paper that there was difficulty in acquiring the journalists and scientists who were willing to be interviewed. What's your take on that? Why difficult? Because there were 19 interviews, right, in this qualitative study that were done. It would have been great to have more, and I think they mentioned this in the paper, right? So why the difficulty there?
Yeah, so that's sort of a double question. That was my first question, because like in science for us, 19 is not a huge number in certain sciences. And so I asked her about it, and she had said that there was more people who responded, but there's sort of this thing called like a saturation, where eventually you start getting the same responses over and over again. And it's like, okay, this is enough to say like, we agree. And so 19 is just sort of this number. I think it's somewhere between like 18 and 20 or something like that. And so that's the number they used. So that wasn't really a problem. But yes, the problem of getting people to respond to get like this diversity of opinions is something that's a little bit difficult. So in the paper, they were talking to scientists who had already talked to the media. And so you don't really get the full scope of what about the scientists who aren't talking to the media, right? What are sort of their views on that? And so that's one of the good things that this paper is useful for, right? Because now we have this, study that's showing, okay, people who have these relationships, they're going well. And that's great to know. And then in general, scientists and journalists are always really busy. And so, it's hard to find people to want to take the time out to participate in these studies, which is understandable, but it's also very unfortunate, right? Because the less people you have involved in these studies, the less we know about groups across, institutions and universities and different journalist groups and all those types of things. So you can really expand this outwards. It's just really convincing people, hey, this is worth taking the 10, 20, 30 minutes out of your day to help us out and really understand this process. And so that was one of like sort of the calls to action on this, is that this is important and it's good that we know these things, but we also need more people to get involved. As someone who has personally chased down several scientists, but then also been chased down by several scientists, you kind of get like, there's a lot going on. And that's just one of those things. We need to get people excited about participating in these types of things so that we can really learn more about how the field itself is growing.
Yeah. And I think they mentioned in the paper as well that a lot of the respondees were from the global north, right? That and also from a specific scientific area. So future studies, right, could expand on that, and it might be interesting to look at different like geographical regions, right, and how the mediatization factors change and differ. Gina, just to ask you, as yourself, you're a science journalist, why should like local community members pay attention to this space, to the work, the research that's taking place between scientists and journalists, right? Looking at that relationship. Why should someone who's not involved in the space, why should they care about this?
Oftentimes, I think, science it's in our everyday life, right? You watch the Weather Channel and that's science, and it's on the news, right? It's just that not every day you see, here's this cool report that came out about, this insect in your area, right? And so those things don't get as much attention, which is where you sort of have to get that engagement. You have to get people excited about things that they wouldn't necessarily go out of their way to look into.
Yeah. No, so I get that point, right? So I guess what I was trying to get at with my question was, in looking at the relationship between journalists and scientists, right? You have local community members that are looking at this, right? They're looking at this relationship, or at least I hope they're looking at this, right? Both of you and I hope that they're looking at this. Why should they pay attention to the relationship, right? This research by Moorhead and her team, we're studying this, right? Why should they care about this relationship and the upcoming results and so forth? Can you talk more specifically about that?
Yeah. I think it's really understanding where your facts are coming from. Mm-hmm. Knowing that scientists and the media have this very important sort of coexisting relationship really gives you the confidence in where your news is coming from. When you hear all of the media about false news and things like that, because oftentimes we don't know where the stories are coming from, who is talking to who and where are these things coming from. And so to know that in the media, scientists and journalists are talking to each other and the truth is being told and conveyed in a way that you understand, but it's not being falsified. And so you sort of have this confidence in the news that you're getting, that it's coming from a reliable source because it's coming from the scientists who did it. But the way that the media is telling it to you is really just in a way that you can really understand for yourself. There's no miscommunication in the way that it's going because you know that the journalist really understands the paper and they took the time to talk to the scientists and break down the complicated facts so that you can understand it in your own capacity. And I think that's a really important relationship in building trust between obviously scientists and the media, but also the public and media, knowing that the science facts that are coming out are actually facts that have been researched and have been, double checked and have this sort of conversation about it. I think that's something that's really important for people to understand because then you're more trusting of the information that you're receiving.
Yeah, and to see the process, right? To understand the process, because we can't assume that everybody knows what actually happens behind the scenes, right? The length of time it takes to fact check these sources or to even engage the scientists, right? And what kinds of questions are scientists asking the journalists during that engagement? I personally think that's just fascinating to look into. So Gina, as we wrap up here, I wish that we can just talk more. In fact, we should have you back and we're going to have you back to continue this conversation. What questions are you excited about in this space, right? Journalists, scientists, what are you excited in 2024? We're talking at the end of 2023 right now. What questions are you excited to see on research papers, scientists to be asking and researchers to be asking specifically at this interface?
I think I'm really excited sort of about the public and media relationship in science writing, because with COVID, there was so much mistrust in the science facts that were coming out. And now that we've got this sort of back end science media relationship that's really sort of pushing hard to get real facts out there to people, I really want to see how that shifts in the media. Are people going to be more trusting of science in the media, and how that's going to impact a lot of decisions that are being made? Because to me, that would be great. If we sort of have this circle of people who are really understanding what's going on, there's no mistrust in any of it. We're reporting the facts, we're reporting them well, so that, if something major were to happen again, there's no massive mistrust, right? We sort of blew up that hole during COVID, oh my gosh, this wasn't perfect. And so I'm excited. I've been watching it rebuild, which is really exciting. And now I'm excited to see sort of how that shifts and see how society is responding to that. Are people really becoming trusting of science news again? And if so, how is that, or is that even changing the way that we sort of perceive all these facts and make our informed decisions and all those types of things? So that's something that I'm personally really excited to look for. And it's also on the other end, people are getting more engaged with science in the media. And so that's really exciting too, because it's no longer like shoving it down the throats of your family members at the dinner table. Now there's people who are like emailing you all excited because you talked about this topic and they learned something and they can take it away and share it with other people. So I'm hoping that that trust sort of continues and we can really get, everyone can be their own little science nerd in some capacity because we can all understand it and it can be really spoken about easily. So that's something that I'm looking forward to.
Wow, there's so much in there to unpack. So with that, we'll adjourn here and looking forward to having you back, Gina, in 2024.